Okay, thanks everyone for having me here. I usually try to gear my talks to my audience quite specifically, but it's interesting to me because I wasn't quite sure who would be in the audience here. In fact, we were talking about this last night, trying to find out who the audience would be. My research is not on open access. I am coming at the question of open access from the perspective of a researcher, but not in the sense that open access is the area of my research, but in the sense that I need sort of practical advice and experience dealing with the question of open access. Now, I hope, since I think that there are a lot of librarians in the audience, this approach will actually be useful to you to get sort of a research practitioner's perspective. I attended the very first UNT Open Access Symposium and heard Stephen Harnad talk about the citation advantage that you receive if you publish open access. Now, this sounded really appealing to me as a researcher. I thought, great, let me try to do that. One of the reasons I wanted to do it is because I'm not on the tenure track. Not being on the tenure track presents certain challenges, but it also frees you up to do various things, including experimenting. And so I thought, okay, look, I don't have to publish in a given set of journals. I can try to pursue open access. And so try to get around this idea of, oh, well, tenure committees won't accept publication in open access journal. They don't have the reputation. I said, I don't care. I want to try to get my reputation higher because I'm basically going it alone anyway. I did, however, and was happy to submit a paper that got accepted for publication in a mainstream philosophy journal, one of the best journals in philosophy of science, known as Synthesa. It was a special issue on the philosophy of interdisciplinarity, and you can see I'm the assistant director of the Center for the Study of Interdisciplinarity, as well as a philosopher. I submitted, after I got accepted, I submitted the Spark Addendum to try to retain some of my copyrights. And the publisher said no. This was a special issue that was put together by some guest editors. And I appealed to them for some support. I said, hey guys, we've worked hard on this. I worked hard on my paper, worked with you, and responded to all the reviewer comments. I think it's a good paper. You think it's a good paper. It's part of your special issue. Will you go to bat for me with the publishers? And they said, are you insane? And I said, no, I really think this is important. I want to make this paper available to more people than people who have subscriptions. And they said, look, are you trying to blow up this special issue? What are you doing? And one of the things that this communicated quite clearly to me is that researchers are ignorant in many, 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 many ways about publishing, about the value of things like open access, and this is going to present real problems, I think, for all of us. I toyed with the idea of, because it had gone through peer review and had been accepted for publication, withdrawing the paper, putting it in the UNT Scholarly Works institutional repository, and saying this was peer reviewed, accepted for publication in Synthesa, but not published there. That was something that I was willing to do that, except for the fact that the editors of the special issue came to me and said, please don't do that. So I signed away my rights, and it got published there. So that's the background to this. I started thinking about why it is that we're a little bit maybe resistant to open access, we researchers. And I got my title for my presentation today from this book by Karl Popper called The Open Society and Its Enemies. This, Jeffrey, might be interesting to you. Popper's one of the big philosophers of science who really paid a lot of attention to the question of demarcation and wanted to separate science from pseudoscience. But he also wrote this book, which is a work of political philosophy. And Popper wrote this as a way of trying to lay out a kind of foundation for a defense of this idea of the open society. But in fact, what happened was he really presented a case, rather than one for the open society, a case against closed societies. And I'll tell you why in a little bit. It's very anti-totalitarian. It's aimed at, he started writing it right before World War II broke out, wrote it during the war. It's anti-Nazi and it's anti-communist. Any form of totalitarian. It's a big, in its defense of individual liberty. And it's closely associated with the political philosophy of liberalism. In fact, Hayek was Popper's mentor at London School of Economics. Now, I did a little research on our keynote speaker, and I found out that she doesn't like the use of the term neoliberalism. So I'm not really going to appeal to that, but I'm going to say that there is a specter of that haunting some of this, and I think it's worth paying attention to. But the thing I want to address then is this notion that you see here in the last bubble, free at last. So I want to question, what does that mean? What do we mean by freedom? And there's another philosopher who has what is a classic description of two different types of freedom. This is Isaiah Berlin. And Berlin says there are two kinds of freedom. There's negative freedom, which means freedom from various things. And then there's positive freedom, which means freedom for various things. And Berlin lays these out. One of the things that happens with negative freedom is there's this emphasis on individual liberty. And the idea with negative freedom is that you're free from any sort of outside interference. Okay? Any sort of outside interference is some sort of evil, according to a negative conception of liberty, and only some of them are necessary evils. So you limit any sort of interference as much as possible. Positive freedom, on the other hand, actually gives a positive account of freedom. There's some kind of goal we're aiming for. And freedom is there in order to allow us to achieve or try to reach that goal. And so limitations on individual freedoms are seen as opportunities to maximize self-determination. In other words, you've got this possibility in positive freedom of having limitations put on you, but as a way for you to take them and move towards the goal. Without those limitations, you wouldn't be able to do that, is the idea. Okay, now, going to this question of open access and what does open mean? Because there is this association, I think, between openness and the idea of liberty in a negative sense. That's Popper. Popper's view was very much a negative idea of liberty, which is why he didn't give a positive account of the open society. He gave a critique of the negative society. Okay, so again, negative freedom is freedom from, positive is freedom for. If you look at open access, somebody who has a negative idea of freedom is going to say something like, look, you know, don't tell me I have to publish in an open access journal. Don't tell me that Office of Science and Technology Policy. Don't tell me that NIH. Don't tell me that NSF. Don't tell me that university. Don't do it. Let me publish wherever I want. And the idea there is any kind of open access mandate is not necessary, it's just evil, right? Because it's impinging on my individual liberty. On the other hand, I think if you've got a positive view of freedom, then you can say something to yourself like, hey, if I publish in an open access journal, that will lead to greater impact for my work. And what I want to do with an open access mandate is actually take advantage of that, right? I want to find ways to make that interference in my individual liberty work to my advantage and work towards achieving this goal of greater impact. Now, I'm going to introduce one more technical term here, which comes from science and technology studies. It's the idea of a socio-technical imaginary. This is something that they're developing in, at Harvard, STS, and usually it's just people right now at Harvard using the term, but let's adopt it here. And to think of open access this way, a socio-technical imaginary combines a technology, combines the idea of co-production, and combines that with this imagined future or goal that we want to achieve. And so if you apply this idea to open access, what we have is an attempt to enlist technology, and in this case it's mostly information technology, to co-produce a future for scholarly communication we'd like to see realized. What that means is that open access rests on a positive idea of freedom, because we do have some kind of imagined future that we're aiming for. That is not something that if you have a negative idea of liberty, you would be interested in doing. So there's what I'm calling tactical recommendations here. We first have to realize, I think, that a lot of resistance comes from people who have a negative idea of liberty, even if they don't know it. That what they want is to be left alone to do it the way they want to do it. We should, I think, also become more aware of instances in which individual liberties are actually impaired by open access. I mean, if you listen to some people, and I think back to Stephen Harnad's talk at the first UNT Open Access Symposium, it was all about mandates. Mandates, 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 right? He still does it every time, mandates. Well, I mean, a lot of people in the audience had to be going, what are you talking about? You're going to make me do something for my own good? This was actually Berlin's critique of the idea of positive freedom, that it can be used in order to tell people, I'm doing this for your own good. And really, you're still free. And he thought that was creepy, and I can see why. But so this is the kind of thing that I think we really need to be aware of. We also, I think, should find ways of describing open access as helping increase individual liberty. That, I think, would be rhetorically quite effective. But I don't think these tactics are enough. I think we also need a strategy. And I think this strategy should be built around this idea of a republic of knowledge. Now, republicanism is another sort of political philosophy that is actually quite compatible with an idea of a sort of slightly limited version of positive freedom, and the idea is non-domination. So you have some kind of mandate out there, but you don't want to dominate people with it. You don't want to use it in an arbitrary fashion. And you want to try to give a rich account of how it actually will help maximize something that they also desire. I think that one really good way for us to do this is to develop a good account of impact. But I think that in keeping with the idea of a socio-technical imaginary, this should be something that all of the stakeholders in terms of research impact have some sort of input in. And so I think you're not just talking about researchers. You're talking about the whole gamut of researchers, universities, administrators, libraries, funding agencies, and then the masses that we were talking about earlier. I think all of them should have some kind of input into this. And finally, I want to say in this slide, this is something that I heard a little bit of in Jeffrey's talk. We need a critical spirit. There's a lot of people, in my experience, who are pro-open access, who are almost zealots about it. Enthusiasm is okay, but when you combine really a lot of enthusiasm with this idea of technological determinism, which is this is just the way it's going to go anyway because of the internet and the World Wide Web, I think that it really can lead to a kind of totalitarianism, and that might then lead to a kind of backlash. I think you're starting to see this now with MOOCs. And you know, you might say, oh, well, open access of scholarly publications is one thing and MOOCs is something totally different. Well, what do they have in common? They have this idea of open in common, and I think that really we need to think about this a little more critically. Okay, so what are some visions of impact? I'm sure you recognize this altmetric donut, and it's really cool and pretty, and it has a big number in it that hopefully you think if this is your publication that that number gets even bigger because it's not complicated. Bigger is better, as they say on the commercial. It's also, you know, really cute. There's a little mascot. President Eisenhower, who just followed me this morning on Twitter. I'm very happy about that. And he's got his own cartoon rendition as well. And so this whole thing about altmetrics is, I think, really attractive to many of us. It's also attractive to publishers, right? They're using this. And if we, as many of us, don't, not I, but many of us don't like these publishers, right? Maybe we should think twice about being co-opted. So let's go with a different group developing altmetrics, right? These guys are bottom up, they're not associated with a company, and they ask good questions like, what do these numbers really mean? Critical spirit, right? Right. But it is still about developing numbers, and I think those are attractive to certain other groups. If you don't recognize him, this is Senator Tom Coburn, who is the source of much of the difficulty for the social sciences. This is Congressman Lamar Smith, who right now is giving the National Science Foundation some real difficulty about the peer review process. But I don't think it's limited to Republicans. I think that the Democrats are really also on this idea of openness and transparency. And, you know, I don't want to use that term, but I think it really is there in the background. And we need to be aware of that too. So there's a danger of being co-opted in a totalitarian way. So finally, I want to end with this slide. I don't want to self-plagiarize, so I want to disclose that this is from a preprint of a correspondence that was just published last week in Nature. They changed it a lot. It doesn't look like this on their site. We at my center got together and started thinking about different indicators of impact. This is one sort of bottom-up approach, I think, where the idea would be not only that we were thinking about impact in weird ways, but by publishing this, we were trying to get more people to think about impact not just as some kind of imposition from the outside, right? Not just as some kind of interference with their freedom, but as a way to describe what they do in a way that will empower them. I was really thinking about this as Jeffrey was giving his talk, because you gave some examples of things that would be highly compatible with this list. The feature of this that Nature picked up on was there are negative indicators here, like lawsuits, being arrested, getting angry letters. And what I am advocating with this actually is that when you talk about the impact of research, what you can do is combine creative metrics like some of the alt metrics, and even things like being threatened with being sued for $1 billion, and craft that into a narrative that gives you a way to talk about the impact of your work in ways that perhaps might not be totally compatible with what members of Congress might want, but which allow us to determine what the impact of our research will be. So, thanks a lot, and now I guess we're all going to have questions, right?